Welcome to the Deep Dive, the
Yeah.
place where we take your sources and extract the knowledge you need fast.
That's right.
You, the learner, sent us a really fascinating YouTube transcript. It covers, well, a real grab bag of current events. So that's exactly what we're going to unpack for you today.
Yeah, think of it as getting the essence, the key insights without having to wade through absolutely everything yourself.
Exactly.
And this source, it touches on local Dutch issues, but also right up to major international affairs.
All right, let's get to it then. We're diving into the riots in Katwijk first.
Okay,
Then we'll look at the situation between Gaza and Israel.
a big one.
Definitely. Followed by Trump's recent moves in the Middle East and those NATO discussions in Turkey with Root involved.
Right.
Our goal really is just to find the most important connections and maybe some surprising takeaways across all of this. Give you a clearer picture without, overwhelming you.
Makes sense.
So first up, Katwijk.
Yeah, that feels like a good starting point. Something that happened right here in the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting, I think, is how this local incident can actually tell us quite a lot about broader societal trends.
So what happened in Katwijk? You had pro-Palestinian demonstrators protesting an event at a church.
Yeah, celebrating Israel's anniversary.
Right. But here's the twist, maybe a fascinating one. They were met by local football supporters.
Rival fans, even.
Rival fans, exactly, who actually sort of joined forces to create a protective line around the church.
It's a really striking image, isn't it? These groups, usually, on opposite sides.
Totally.
Finding a common purpose in this specific situation, it really underscores the intensity, I think, of feelings around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even here.
So what does that alliance suggest?
Well, it suggests maybe that on certain issues, local identities or shared, perhaps, nationalistic feelings can override those traditional rivalries. It highlights a potentially powerful, if maybe unpredictable, social force when faced with what's seen as an external provocation.
And this event, it wasn't just random. It was attended by some prominent figures,
Right.
including Christophe and the SGP, that's the Conservative Protestant political party,
Yes.
and Modif Ephraim, the Israeli ambassador to the Netherlands.
Okay.
And we also learned from the source that the pro-Palestinian demonstration, it was organized by Abu Hafs,
Also known as Abu Ir.
right? Described as a radical Islamist figure.
Yeah, that adds another layer, doesn't it? It wasn't just like a spontaneous thing.
No.
There was some organization behind it, and by someone with a known background. It makes you wonder about the specific aims of that protest.
And, as you might expect, the situation, well, it escalated.
Mm-hmm.
While those football supporters initially formed that protective barrier, reports seem to indicate that the violence might have actually started with them.
Right. So it's complex.
Very complex, yeah. Confusing, really.
It is. And how some people are interpreting these events is, well, it's quite revealing. It's being seen by some as evidence, maybe. Evidence of the Dutch government's failure to maintain order.
Okay.
And crucially, to ensure the safety of Jewish communities here in the Netherlands. That reflects a deeper anxiety, I think, a sense of vulnerability.
And we also heard about Femke Halsema, the mayor of Amsterdam,
Yes.
commenting on the murder of Palestinians. That drew a response from the Dutch cabinet.
It did. And there's this perception, right or wrong, that maybe Halsema aligns herself somewhat with the Denk party.
The party focusing on migrant interest, yeah.
Which just adds another political dimension to her statements,
It shows how quickly local events can become national news, touch on international issues even.
Exactly. Halsema's comments, the reactions, it just illustrates the sensitivities around discussing Israel-Palestine, how easily things escalate.
Misinterpretations happen.
Yeah, and her perceived alignment with Denk just, well, it fuels the polarization that's already there.
And this Katwijk event, it didn't happen in a vacuum, did it? Seems connected to wider unease.
I think so, a resistance to what some see as provocations from pro-Palestinian groups.
The source even mentioned an example. Disturbances related to asylum seekers in Sint-Anne-Parochie.
Right, suggesting a broader frustration, maybe,
Yes.
with perceived issues in governance integration.
So connecting the dots.
If you connect this to the bigger picture, yeah, you see a pattern, local anxieties popping up in different ways. Katwijk becomes another piece of the puzzle, really, in understanding the current social climate here, where immigration, integration, international conflicts, they all intersect and create tension.
Which brings us to a fundamental point. The right to protest.
Always key in a democracy.
Absolutely. But the source raises valid concerns, like masked demonstrators, property damage,
Especially at universities, yeah. They mentioned Alexander Van Uffelen at Radboud.
and the UVA board member meeting masked individuals.
Yeah, this is a really delicate balance, isn't it? Protest is essential, but not at the expense of others' safety or rights or destroying property.
And the masks.
The masks raise questions, accountability, potential intimidation. Where's the line between legitimate protest and actions that actually undermine democracy?
It's a tough question.
Very.
The source also mentioned organizing protests to avoid counter-demonstrations. That sounds tricky.
It is tricky. You want people to protest freely, without fear,
Sure.
but trying to prevent any opposing view. That could be seen as limiting expression, too. The challenge is finding ways for different views to coexist, even when they're clashing.
What's also concerning, the source notes, is this increasing polarization and the role of intellectuals. Sinan Kinkaya was mentioned, who seem to be legitimizing really strong criticism of the Netherlands regarding Gaza.
Yeah, and this is where the discourse can get very charged. When intellectual voices use strong language, assign significant blame.
It could inflame things.
It can, yeah, contribute to hostility. It's crucial to really look critically at those criticisms, consider a range of perspectives.
And here's a connection that really jumped out at me from the source.
Okay.
Drawing a link between the treatment of Muslims in the Netherlands and the situation in Gaza.
Yeah.
Even using a personal anecdote, like my mother said.
That's a potentially problematic rhetorical strategy.
Why problematic?
Well, feeling solidarity is understandable, of course, but drawing a direct parallel, conflating experiences here with the dire situation in Gaza, it risks oversimplifying things.
Right.
And potentially fueling division, resentment,
And the source analyzes the dangers of this shift.
Yeah.
Moving from criticizing policies to maybe something closer to ethnic or racist arguments.
Exactly. And there's also a concern raised about some on the left maybe aligning, perhaps unintentionally, with radical Islamist elements because of their sympathy for Gaza.
That's a serious concern.
It's a critical point. Expressing solidarity with Palestinians is legitimate, of course.
Yeah.
But it's vital to be aware that sympathy can be exploited, co-opted by groups with agendas beyond just Palestinian rights. You have to keep a clear distinction between humanitarian concerns and extremist ideologies. It's essential.
Okay, let's pivot now to the core of the conflict. Gaza and Israel.
Right.
The source immediately starts by acknowledging the horrific nature of Hamas's actions. October 7th. The hostages.
It's crucial. Any discussion has to start there. Hamas actions were brutal, a violation of human rights, a huge and damaging escalation. Understanding that context is fundamental.
But then the discussion moves very quickly to criticism of Netanyahu's policies. Talk of destroying Gaza, displacing Palestinians, even this idea of transferring them elsewhere.
Yeah.
The source called it Trump's Riviera idea.
Yeah, that refers to a past suggestion by Trump about relocating Palestinians, essentially population transfer.
Which raises huge red flags.
Immediately. Under international law, ethically,
Right.
the idea of large-scale destruction, forced displacement, it's deeply problematic, goes against established norms, agreements.
Which brings up the whole question of international norms, law, agreements in the context of Israel's actions.
Precisely. Israel, like any nation, has to act within international law, even in conflict. So questions come up about proportionality, responsibility towards civilians in Gaza.
But the source also presents the counter-argument.
Yes, Hamas responsibility.
The ongoing conflict, right? By not releasing hostages, by firing rockets, even after Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005.
That's a really important point, often gets overlooked. Hamas's continued aggression, refusal to release hostages, huge factors in the conflict continuing. It's a tragic cycle, really. Both sides bear responsibility.
Then there's the complexity of urban warfare itself.
Immense complexity.
And the conflicting figures on civilian casualties. It's just incredibly hard to get accurate information.
Absolutely. Urban warfare is inherently complex, and tragically, civilians always suffer. The conflicting figures just show how hard it is to get reliable info. We desperately need independent verification.
And the issue of withholding food from Gaza. Hugely contentious.
Deeply troubling.
Israel claims weapons and aid trucks, UNRWA corruption. While the world sees a humanitarian crisis, images of malnutrition.
Yeah. Israel has legitimate security concerns, no doubt. But restricting essential aid, the impact on civilians raises very serious humanitarian questions. And those accusations against UNRWA need thorough, impartial investigation, too.
The source mentioned the conflicting death tolls again, and Hamas shifting its claims about how many militants were killed.
Right.
It just underscores how hard it is to trust information coming straight out of a conflict zone.
Indeed. Information becomes a weapon in conflict. Verifying claims from any side is incredibly challenging. Highlights the need for critical thinking, looking at multiple sources.
Then there's the idea of a large-scale evacuation of Gaza
Mm-hmm.
and increasing talk, apparently, about Palestinians moving to Jordan or Egypt. A view Wilders holds notably.
Highly controversial proposal raises fundamental questions about Palestinian rights to their homeland.
And would Jordan or Egypt even take them?
That's the critical factor. Historically, Arab nations have been reluctant for significant reasons.
Which leads us right to the core question. Palestinian rights to Gaza, the West Bank, versus the massive complexities of the two-state solution, the history, 1967 borders.
This really is the heart of it, isn't it? The historical claims, counterclaims, UN resolutions, the reality on the ground. It all makes a just, lasting solution incredibly elusive.
The two-state solution seems further away than ever.
It faces huge obstacles now, yeah. It used to be the main framework. What's clear is both sides operate under these seemingly irreconcilable narratives of victimhood, historical rights, makes peace incredibly difficult.
The Oslo Accords get a brief mention too, the divided control of the West Bank.
Oslo was a significant attempt, but failing to fully implement it left the West Bank fragmented, tense.
And it's important to remember, there are Arab citizens within Israel.
Absolutely. Often overlooked.
Their perspectives are diverse, not monolithic.
Exactly. They have unique experiences, perspectives. Crucial for understanding the complexities within Israeli society itself.
And the Gaza war, it's undoubtedly hit social cohesion inside Israel hard.
Conflict often does that, tragically.
Right.
Exacerbates existing divisions. This war has likely amplified tensions, making reconciliation even harder.
There's even a personal anecdote in the source about Israelis living under constant rocket threat.
Mm-hmm.
Brings a human element, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Behind the politics, real people living in fear.
Those personal stories are so vital, understanding the lived realities, the impact on individuals, communities, on both sides.
The source then talks about the dead end of just moral outrage, if it's not linked to practical solutions.
Right.
Acknowledging the two-state solution seems increasingly unlikely right now, after October 7th.
Moral outrage is understandable, certainly, but it needs to lead to constructive action. The current reality suggests the traditional two-state solution might not be viable as it was. We need to look for new, maybe less conventional approaches.
Which leads to considering these, quote, exotic solutions like population transfer,
Mm-hmm.
while also noting Egypt's borders firmly closed.
Yeah, and for very real reasons, the risk of destabilization inside Egypt.
These radical solutions get discussed, but
They come with huge ethical, practical challenges. Neighboring countries' reluctance is deep-rooted. History, politics, internal stability concerns.
parallels are drawn to Ukraine.
Yes.
The principle of not rewarding the stronger party through territorial concessions raises questions about consistency and how the world responds to different conflicts.
That comparison really makes you reflect, doesn't it? On the principles guiding international diplomacy, are there double standards in how conflicts are handled?
The lack of Arab nations willing to absorb Palestinians is highlighted again. Destabilization fears.
It's a critical geopolitical reality. That fear has been a long-standing, significant concern in the region.
Then the discussion loops back to Palestinian claims to Gaza and the West Bank,
Mm-hmm.
linking it again to Israel's 2005 Gaza withdrawal and the rocket fire that followed.
Brings us back to the cycle of conflict. The struggle for control, security. The 2005 withdrawal was significant, but tragically it didn't bring lasting peace.
Potential interim solutions are mentioned, like continued Israeli administrative control.
Briefly, yeah. Such solutions might offer a temporary fix, manage the immediate situation, but they don't really address the fundamental issues: sovereignty, self-determination for Palestinians.
The source also acknowledges internal resistance to Hamas within Gaza,
Yes.
but also the real, understandable fear of reprisal. Highlights the incredibly tough spot Gazans are in.
Absolutely underscores the tragic dynamics within Gaza, the population caught between Hamas rule and the devastating consequences of the conflict.
We, the hosts in the source, then briefly mention our own diverse experiences, how we were socialized regarding the conflict, as a personal layer.
It's important to acknowledge, isn't it? Our backgrounds, experiences, they shape how we see complex issues like this. Generational differences can be significant too.
The democratic nature of Israel, the potential for future political change. That's touched on briefly.
Yeah, offers a glimpse of potential shifts down the line.
Because despite everything, Israel remains a democracy. Political changes are possible within the system. That could be an avenue for shifts in policy approach. This leads to a broader point about changing dynamics in democracies globally. Schoof in the Netherlands, Macron in France are mentioned.
Interesting connection. Suggests maybe the shifts we're seeing in political landscapes are part of a broader trend across democracies, reflecting deeper societal changes, anxieties perhaps.
And demonstrations within Israel against the government's policies are noted too.
Right. Shows there isn't a unified view there either.
These protests are a really important reminder of the internal debates, disagreements within Israel about handling the conflict.
Definitely.
Netanyahu's leadership style is then linked to the rise of a new kind of politician. Trumpism, essentially.
Characterized by a certain approach to power, governance.
That's a fascinating connection to make.
It really invites analysis, doesn't it? Different leadership styles, the impact of populist leaders on longstanding conflicts, international relations.
And the potential for this conflict to be used to justify big political changes within Israel. That's raised as a concern.
In crises, there's always that risk, isn't there? Governments seeking to consolidate power, implement major changes. This conflict is, unfortunately, no exception.
Divisions within Israeli society.
Yeah.
Potential for a more theocratic state in the future. That's discussed.
Yeah, contrasting with secular, progressive elements also present.
It highlights the internal cultural, political struggles in Israel. Different visions for the state's future are really in contention.
Very much so.
The source also notes the strong economic activity in Israel and that ongoing tension between the military and Orthodox communities over conscription adds more layers.
Those internal dynamics, secular versus religious, the military service debate, they're key factors that will keep shaping Israel's future.
And finally, the background of many Israeli Jews from the former Soviet Union.
Yes.
And their potentially more hardline security views, mentioned as another influential factor.
Yeah, that historical demographic context provides valuable insight into the diverse perspectives within Israeli society, the influences shaping policy.
Okay, let's shift gears. Trump in the Middle East and those NATO discussions.
Right.
The source briefly mentions Trump visiting Saudi Arabia and Qatar, including, well, the rather noteworthy gift of an airplane from Qatar.
That certainly makes you raise an eyebrow.
It does. What's fascinating, I guess, is the continued engagement there, often through this lens of personal relationships, almost transactional diplomacy, it seems.
Yeah, that visit underscores his continued engagement, maybe in that style. Personal relationships, transactional diplomacy seems a fair description. The airplane gift definitely stands out.
This leads us to the NATO discussions in Turkey.
Okay.
Framed as prep for the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague, June 24th, 25th.
Right, setting a stage.
And the central discussion, no surprise, was defense spending targets,
Always a hot topic.
with both Trump and Rutte proposing a big increase, up to 5%.
Wow, 5%?
Yeah. This push reflects growing concern among allies, doesn't it? About the geopolitical landscape. Ukraine. Perceived threats.
Yeah, that push for more spending really shows a heightened level of concern among NATO allies. Ukraine, Russia, other threats. It's driving this.
Rutte apparently clarified that this 5% would be like 3.5% for core defense and 1.5% for other security-related spending. Maybe makes the number sound a bit less daunting.
That distinction is important, yeah. Acknowledges security is broader now. Cybersecurity, intelligence, not just tanks and planes.
And quantifying it. 5% could mean an extra 30 billion euros for Dutch defense spending.
A huge jump.
Up from the current 24 billion. And across Europe, Ursula von der Leyen's figures suggest even bigger potential increases.
Wow.
Some are framing this as like a Cold War 2.0 arms race starting.
The scale certainly evokes Cold War parallels, doesn't it? Signals a massive shift in priorities, resource allocation towards military and security.
But here's a really interesting angle from the source.
Oh.
Analyzing how these increased budgets might actually be spent, suggesting a chunk could support struggling European industries.
Like the German auto industry they mentioned.
Exactly. Rather than just purely military hardware, it's like a blurring line between security needs and industrial policy.
That's a really insightful point. It highlights how defense spending could be strategically linked to industrial policy. Investing in dual-use tech, supporting European industries, justified under national security, maybe offering broader economic benefits.
And this increased NATO spending is also being connected to Ukraine.
How so?
Suggested it might be leverage for a future peace settlement.
Okay. A potential strategy where a stronger military posture becomes a bargaining chip in future negotiations.
Seems plausible.
It does. A strategy where stronger collective defense is used as leverage in diplomacy to resolve the Ukraine conflict.
The ongoing talks in Istanbul are mentioned, and the high demand some European nations are placing on Russia. Demands Russia doesn't seem to be taking too seriously right now.
That disconnect really underscores the deep divisions, doesn't it? The difficulty in finding common ground for a settlement.
Definitely. And the U.S. role, especially Trump's perspective, on Russia-Ukraine. That's discussed, noting different views within the U.S. administration itself.
Yeah, the uncertainty around U.S. policy, especially with elections coming up, adds another layer of complexity. Makes predicting things even harder.
Very true. The current stalemate in Ukraine is highlighted. And this anticipation that Trump might take a clearer stance eventually.
Given the deadlock, anticipation of a clearer U.S. position, especially if the administration changes, could be pivotal for future diplomacy.
The source presents these differing reasons for European rearmament.
Right.
On one hand, it's a direct response to Putin's aggression.
The primary driver for many.
But on the other, there's some skepticism about Russia's broader intentions, beyond its immediate neighbors.
Yeah, highlighting the ongoing debate in Europe. How real is the Russian threat beyond Ukraine? What's the right response? Some see rearmament as essential deterrence. Others are more skeptical about imminent danger to NATO itself.
The idea of Russia posing an imminent threat to, say, Poland is specifically questioned.
While concerns about Ukraine are valid, the idea of an imminent attack on NATO territory is viewed with some skepticism by some, especially given NATO's collective defense capabilities.
The source then argues for a sensible defense policy, one that also benefits European industry.
More pragmatic, economically beneficial approach.
Yeah, advocating for a policy that ensures security, but also contributes to economic growth, tech advancement within Europe.
Makes sense.
Criticism is aimed at what's seen as a one-dimensional focus on just military buildup.
Right.
Advocating instead for a smarter EU vision, combining defense with diplomacy, coexistence.
Arguing for a more comprehensive approach. Recognizing the limits of purely military solutions, emphasizing diplomacy, fostering coexistence.
Germany's historical role as a mediator is noted, and its current shift towards building the largest army in Europe. That's a really significant change.
That shift in Germany's posture is a major turning point. Big implications for the balance of power in Europe, its international role.
And support for increased military spending seems quite broad politically in some places, even including some on the left.
Yeah, suggests security concerns and the need for robust defense are shared across a wider political spectrum in some European countries now.
The failed negotiation attempts with Russia are discussed. That train journey to Kiev
Yes.
and Putin's countermove on the schedule highlights the deep mistrust, the obstacles to dialogue.
Those failures really underscore the challenges in negotiating with Russia, the deep-seated mistrust.
The dynamics between Trump and Putin get a brief analysis.
What's the take?
Suggestion is Putin skillfully playing on Trump's vanity to advance his own goals.
Leveraging Trump's personality, his desire for personal success in diplomacy. Plausible.
Potential endgame scenarios for Ukraine are explored briefly. Territorial concessions, NATO membership complexities.
Acknowledging the immense difficulties in getting outcomes acceptable to everyone.
These scenarios highlight the painful compromises that might be needed and the huge obstacles to a lasting, just peace.
Very true.
The strong influence of Baltic and Polish perspectives on EU policy towards Russia, that's highlighted. Driven by historical trauma.
Yeah, their experiences have definitely shaped their strong stance and influence within the EU on Russia policy.
A note of concern is expressed, though,
Oh.
about EU policy maybe being too shaped by those with a strong anti-Russian agenda.
Suggesting a need for more balance, nuance, perhaps?
That seems to be the implication.
Yeah.
Raising a question about whether policy might be disproportionately influenced by certain historical grievances, hindering a more balanced approach.
Interesting point.
Empathy for Ukrainians. Desire for a peaceful resolution. That's reiterated strongly.
Amidst all the geopolitics, yeah. Absolutely crucial to remember the human cost. The urgent need for peace, respecting Ukraine's sovereignty, integrity.
The risk of NATO being influenced by specific national agendas. And the importance of national control over troop deployments. Briefly touched on.
Highlights that ongoing tension. Collective defense within NATO versus sovereign rights of member states over their own forces.
And finally, a brief, stark note. The arms industry is doing very well right now.
A sobering reality.
Tragically, conflict often creates huge economic opportunities for the arms industry. It can complicate peace efforts sometimes.
Indeed.
Okay, moving on. A rather different, maybe surprising topic, Afrikaner asylum seekers and a new migration museum.
Quite a shift.
Yeah. The source mentions 59 Afrikaners granted U.S. political asylum under Trump
Right.
based on claims of discrimination in South Africa. Caused quite a stir at the time.
It certainly did. Granting asylum on that basis challenged conventional ideas of who qualifies as a refugee, drew criticism from various sides.
It really brought to the surface this perception that refugee status is often tied, maybe implicitly, to certain ethnic or economic backgrounds.
Raised fundamental questions about who's seen as a legitimate asylum seeker.
It exposed underlying biases, assumptions about who deserves protection, prompted a broader discussion about the definition, application of refugee status.
Definitely.
The source mentions a comment, a black political commentator suggesting these Afrikaners should return to Germany or the Netherlands,
Okay.
which prompted a counter-question. Well, what's the logic of applying that to other migrant groups in Europe? Exposes inconsistencies.
That pointed exchange really highlights the contradictions that pop up in immigration debates. Often reveals underlying assumptions, biases.
The U.S. government's rationale for granting the asylum, perceived danger in South Africa, farm attacks specifically.
Yeah.
That's explained.
Yeah. The U.S. cited farm attacks, perceived vulnerability of Afrikaners as the basis, though that remains a contentious interpretation of the situation in South Africa overall.
And the source connects those farm attacks more to class divisions, not just race.
Offers a different perspective, yeah. More nuanced. Suggesting economic factors, land ownership issues might be bigger drivers than just racial animosity.
Which leads us, somewhat abruptly, to a new migration museum opening in Rotterdam.
Funded by the Vanderform family.
Right. And given the current climate, debates around immigration, identity, such museum is potentially quite politically charged.
Indeed. In a time of intense debate, opening a migration museum is almost bound to spark discussion, maybe controversy.
While acknowledging it could be welcome, the source makes an important point about balance,
What's the point?
suggesting such institutions need to be accompanied by others exploring Dutch identity, what it means to be Dutch today.
Highlighting the need for a balanced historical narrative. Immigration story alongside understanding the receiving society's history, culture, values.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Questions are then raised about how easy it is to get Dutch citizenship, and maybe a lack of emphasis on integration, language, history, culture.
Speaks to broader concerns, doesn't it? About requirements for citizenship, its deeper meaning. Is enough emphasis placed on successful integration?
The suggestion is made that clearer citizenship criteria could actually lead to better integration.
A more defined understanding of what being Dutch means, language, civic knowledge, cultural understanding, could potentially help integration outcomes for everyone.
The source then briefly touches on the inherent tragedy often involved in immigration.
The human cost.
Uprooting lives, separating families, leaving familiar places behind, often overlooked in policy debates.
It's crucial to remember that human element, the incredibly hard choices people make, the sense of loss, displacement that often comes with it.
An interesting parallel is drawn to Romania,
Oh.
where emigration due to free movement in the EU is apparently causing some resentment, fueling anti-EU sentiment.
Illustrates that migration, either way in or out, can have big social, political consequences, sometimes unexpected backlash.
This connects to that intuitive, deep bond people have with their homeland.
That attachment to place of origin, powerful force.
Peter Omsik's feelings about being far from Enschede while working in The Hague are mentioned.
A relatable human detail.
Yeah, resonates with that broader theme of attachment to place, challenges of displacement, even within your own country. The current dynamics within the NSC party, briefly touch on. Just a nod to ongoing Dutch politics.
Right, acknowledging the evolving political landscape here.
And Agnes Jongerius and her pension proposals get a quick mention too. Ongoing domestic policy debate.
Just a reminder that amidst everything else, important domestic issues impacting citizens' lives continue.
Okay, briefly shifting to a slightly lighter note. The Eurovision Song Contest result is mentioned.
Assuming you, the listener, probably saw how that went.
Yeah, a quick nod to a big cultural event.
Generates a lot of talk across Europe.
But the reception of the Israeli representative at Eurovision is discussed. Noting the hostile protests, the anti-Semitic sentiments expressed by some, which the source speaker views as highlighting a dysfunctional state in Europe right now.
Yeah, underscores how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict unfortunately spills over, even into cultural events,
Yeah.
and the regrettable presence of anti-Semitism in some reactions.
The Dutch Football League gets a quick mention, too. PSV likely winning over Ajax.
Mm.
Difficult situation for the Ajax trainer, Farioli, described as an interesting philosopher.
A brief local sports update, with a nod to the trainer's perhaps more philosophical approach.
And finally, the upcoming World Cup in the U.S. and Mexico.
Looking ahead.
Potential of the Dutch team mentioned. A hopeful note for Dutch sports fans.
A quick look ahead to a major event. Hopes for the Orange.
Well, that really was a deep dive, wasn't it?
It certainly was.
We've journeyed through, wow, a really broad spectrum, local tensions in Katwijk, huge complexities of Israel-Palestine, NATO dynamics, asylum policies, national identity. What really stands out is just how interconnected all these seemingly separate things actually are.
Absolutely. Understanding the underlying tensions, the history, the many different perspectives, it's crucial for navigating our complex world today.
Yeah.
We really hope this deep dive has given you, the learner, a more nuanced, informed understanding of all these issues we've covered.
And on that thought, here's one final question for you to really get you thinking. Considering all the deep-seated historical grievances, the often totally conflicting narratives we've explored today, what single underlying factor do you personally believe most significantly hinders resolving these really complex global conflicts?
Good question.
Something to mull over, definitely. Maybe even to delve into further yourself.
Thanks for joining us here on The Deep Dive.